Hi, and welcome to this online resource on writing your teaching statement for the academic job market. My name is Erica, and I'm with the Writing Hub in the Teaching and Learning Commons at UC San Diego. Let's get started. This online resource is divided into 3 different parts. We do recommend that you engage with the resource in this order. In the first part, we'll talk about a general teaching statement overview and helpful approaches for working in this genre. Part 1 ends with a worksheet where you can think about your experiences, whether they're direct teaching experiences or indirect educational and mentoring experiences, all of which might be relevant to the teaching statement you want to write. In Part 2, we'll think about how to select and organize from those experiences and how to research different institutional contexts so that you can make your experiences relevant to your audience. And the worksheet in Part 2 talks about finding themes that cut across the different experiences that you might want to talk about in your statement and how to connect those themes to different institutional contexts. In Part 3, we'll end with some strategies for drafting, organizing, and revising your teaching statement and put you in the right direction for getting feedback on your drafts before you submit. Okay, let's get started with Part 1. In this video, we'll talk about the genre, audience, and purpose of a teaching statement and consider some of the experiences that you have around teaching and the priorities that you might want to convey in your teaching statement. So here's some helpful ways to think about a teaching statement. Let's think about the genre, audience, and purpose. You're probably already familiar with these terms. A genre is simply the implied expectations of what an audience person brings to reading the document. It's what they expect to see, and also what they expect the document to cover and to talk about. The audience, of course, are the people who will engage with your statement, and you make considerations with your audience in mind. And the idea with the teaching statement is that you want to make decisions in your statement that will be able to connect with real human readers on their terms. And we'll explain a little bit more about that in Part 2. And then the purpose. This is what you're trying to convey, the overall communication goal of a teaching statement. And so the teaching statement is an interesting genre in terms of this purpose because it's about you. You want to communicate about yourself, but it's not for you. You're trying to connect yourself to other people. So let's start there. Let's start with purpose. We should just say that teaching statements are kind of hard to write. A lot of personal statements, like your statement of purpose for graduate school or cover letters, are hard to write because they're about you, but they're written for an audience that has a resource that you want. And so it can be pretty tricky. We don't have a lot of experience in these genres, and they just feel kind of bizarre to a lot of us who write them. So here's your purpose, a general purpose that I think should be helpful and a guiding light for you as you work on this teaching statement. Your purpose in a teaching statement is just to reveal how you think about teaching and learning. That's it, how you think about it. It means that you've learned a thing or two about teaching and learning, and you have, through the course of being in graduate school and being a student yourself, you have learned a thing or two. So you want to demonstrate that you're reflective about your role as a future teacher, and you're coming into that role equipped with some thoughts and some priorities that you want to pursue when you become a faculty at this institution. It shows that you care enough about teaching that you think about it and deeply reflect on it. And then finally, your purpose is to communicate your teaching experiences. So this is not necessarily a review of the things that they would find in your CV. Your teaching statement is not where you reveal, I've done this, and I've done that. It's where you get to tell a story. It's where you get to talk about the big themes and the interests that you have around teaching. It's not necessarily where you review all of the experiences that you've had, though the experiences that you've had will help you draw out those themes and explain those priorities in greater detail. So you'll apply what you've learned. The idea with the teaching statement is that you know that you can apply what you've learned about teaching and learning to your future role as a teacher. Okay, so here's some information on the genre. This is generally what the document looks like. Generally, these statements are pretty brief, maybe 1.5, 2 pages. I've not seen teaching statements that are more than 2 pages. So that means that your prose needs to be clear, direct, and concise. I would emphasize that you should aim for writing in a way that's simple and clear rather than smart or academic sounding. You don't need to overload this statement with a lot of terminology or buzzwords just to show that you know them. It's better to communicate simply and clearly. You should generally use a first-person approach. That means you'll use I statements, even if you've mostly just co-taught with other folks where you've been involved in a teaching team. You should emphasize yourself and what you've done and use I statements. You should consider both your teaching experiences, but also how that connects to student learning. So in your priorities around teaching, it's also important to recognize that your teaching affects students and their ability to learn and their ability to thrive in your courses. And so do consider students' perspectives when you're thinking about your statement. Generally, you want to try to be specific rather than abstract. And what we mean by that is that when you're talking about things that you care about and that you're interested in, that you are able to provide concrete examples or experiences that help you draw those out and explain them in more careful detail. Generally, we say you should show, not just tell. So don't just tell the audience what you're interested in and what you care about. You need to show them through talking about specific examples from your experiences. And generally, a teaching statement is organized around themes. We'll talk a little bit more about organization in part 2, but for right now, we'll say the statement is organized around themes and then experiences that tell stories and draw out that theme in more careful detail, gesture to the significance or the lesson learned from those experiences, and then the implications for your future self as a teacher in a different institutional context. And finally, let's talk about your audience. So it's important to recognize that the audience is a really tricky thing in a teaching statement because we don't know a lot about the audiences who will read this. We know that it will probably be a search committee. It might entail different faculty. It might entail some graduate students. It might entail some administration staff from academic personnel or similar offices. But other than that, we don't know a lot about them. And audience can be tricky because you know your audience is controlling a resource, i.e. a job that you want. And so it can be really tempting to just try to write for who you think they want you to be. But that can be hard. So it's important to recognize that what you do know about this audience matters. You know that this audience, no matter who they are, care about this field. They care about the discipline that you're in. And they care about high quality education in their field. So they want people who can teach undergraduates and graduate students well, who can have positive impact on the educational environment, and that their institutional context shapes how education happens there. So whether this is a small liberal arts university, a primarily undergraduate university, or an R1 university that also produces PhDs, that institutional context is going to shape how education occurs in their departments and in their field. They have a need for a professional who can be an educator in that discipline. And of course, like all humans, they want to work with good colleagues. They want to work with people who can teach them, who can inspire them, who can listen and be humble enough to learn from each other. So in your teaching statement, you want to recognize these are human being people. You don't know a lot about them, but what you do know matters. They're looking for someone who can join their department and be a good educator and a good colleague in their department. So hold on to that. So connecting with your audience, I think we've generally talked about this, that there is a fine line between connecting with your audience and then writing what you think they want to hear. And that's a tricky balance. And I think that's what makes teaching statements particularly difficult. So if your statement feels phony or gross, if you feel like you are selling a version of yourself that you don't actually believe, I think that's an indicator that you're overly considering your audience and you're trying to go too much in the direction of what do they want from me? I need to convince them that I'm the person that I think they want. And instead, I would encourage you to come back to more of an authentic purpose. What do you care about and what do you want to convey? In this genre, I think the best way to connect with your audience is to show them an authentic view into how you think about teaching and learning based on a curated retelling of significant teaching experiences that reflects an awareness of their institutional context. So let's dig into that a little bit more. So again, in this genre, the best way to connect with your audience is to show them an authentic view into how you think about teaching and learning. So anytime that your teaching statement is starting to feel a little phony, a little gross, maybe a little fictional, come back to this purpose, right? That this is about you expressing your authentic thoughts and your authentic priorities and values around teaching and education. That's what your audience really wants to see. This exploration of what you think and how you think about teaching is based on a curated retelling of significant teaching experiences. We're going to talk a little bit more about this in a moment, but for now, I want to emphasize 3 different points here. First, your significant teaching experiences. The experiences that you draw in a teaching statement might be directly related to teaching. Courses you've TA'd for, courses where you've been an instructor. That's great, but they don't have to. Any experience where you've developed the qualities or the dispositions of an effective educator can also be relevant experiences in a teaching statement. When you talk about the experiences, whether they're mentoring and education experiences or direct teaching experiences, you're basically retelling a story of that experience. You're not necessarily reporting on it. You're not giving all the factual details. You're telling a story about the experience and the lesson that you learned from that experience. And so in order to do that well, you need to curate what experiences you're going to include. Imagine that you're picking different elements between these experiences to put them together to create harmony and give a whole picture. So you're not including everything, you're curating a list of significant experiences that you can talk through and retell the story of those experiences. And you want to do this in a way that reflects an awareness of the institutional context, recognizing that an institutional context really shapes how education occurs. So when you're connecting with your audience, you want to show that you understand the context happening in their department or at their university, and that you're ready to contribute to education in that particular context. We'll talk more about this bullet point in part 2. So let's get on this curated retelling. Let's think a little bit about it. I like this show MasterChef, but I think any other reality cooking show could also be relevant here. Imagine you're watching this show and these cooks need to make a dish. And so generally there's this scene in every reality TV cooking show where these chefs or these cooks are running into a pantry and they're trying to select from all of these different things. I need this ingredient, that ingredient. And they're trying to select ingredients that will work closely and nicely together to harmonize together to make a delicious and beautiful dish. Your teaching statement is not that dissimilar from that. I want you to imagine that you have a pantry of experiences and a pantry of lessons that you've learned that you can select from. In fact, the Part 1 worksheet is going to help you develop that kind of inventory. And so you would go into this pantry, you'd go into this experience inventory, and you would select the experiences that you want to talk about that would work together and contribute to the whole dish, the whole story of who you are and the sort of main things that you want to convey about yourself as a future educator. And what you choose to emphasize, which elements you select, depends on what matters to you, so you should think carefully about that. And it might depend on the context of your audience. So you might consider whether this is a small liberal arts institution, if this is a large research university, and you would select the experiences based on the context of your audience as well as what matters to you. And if you're not sure how to do them both, I would suggest that you start on just what matters to you and select the experiences that can help you connect to what matters to you. I think it's important to emphasize with this that your most impressive teaching experience, the one that is really great and amazing, may or may not be selected depending on whether it can help you convey what is important and whether it would be relevant to the context of your audience. So just know that you can include those kinds of experiences, but just because you have a really impressive teaching experience doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be relevant to the statement that you're trying to write. That depends on the themes that you want to explore and the audience context that you're trying to connect to. And okay, so I did mention that your experiences can be relevant in lots of different ways, or lots of different experiences can be relevant to a teaching statement. So I'd say that any experience where you develop the qualities of an effective educator can be relevant to this genre. If you have direct teaching experiences where you've been a TA or an instructor, you should certainly draw upon those if they help you convey the themes that you want. But you can also consider other activities that help you develop the qualities of an effective educator. That might be mentoring, any kind of advising that you've done with students or student organizations, whether you've been a peer mentor to graduate students or other post notes docs. This is a really helpful way to think about thinking about experiences for your teaching statement is to consider the experiences where you're developing as an educator, not necessarily just as a quote unquote teacher in a classroom. Lots of experiences can be relevant to this. So I'd encourage you to think about these questions. What are the qualities of an effective educator? Think of positive teachers that you've had or effective educators that you've encountered in your life, and what are they like? What do they do? What makes them so special? What makes them so effective? And then consider what experiences have you had that have helped you develop those same qualities. So maybe you're thinking an effective educator is one who's really organized, who can lay all of the pieces out, help them make sense together. So consider experiences that you've had where you've had to be really organized and you've had to develop that kind of organization in order to help people follow along with a complex project or a complex set of procedures or something like that. And then consider how that experience is going to shape your future teaching goals. So these questions are available in the Part 1 worksheet, so you can brainstorm a little further. In addition to those questions, we also have these questions. If you have teaching experiences or mentorship experiences, again, think about any experience where you have been a quote-unquote educator. You can think about one of your proudest moments as an educator, something you've learned about teaching or mentoring that has surprised you, or a moment of mismatch between expectations and reality. And for each of these questions, I'd ask you to explore how they connect to your future teaching intentions in addition to what you've learned from these experiences that have helped you think about teaching more carefully. So at this point, I think you should start on the Part 1 worksheet. So if you go back to the folder and download the Part 1 worksheet, it's a Word file so that you can type directly in it. So spend some time free writing on the responses and the questions, and when you're ready, move on to the Part 2 video. The Part 1 worksheet is this experience inventory. The idea is that you spend some time free writing on these questions, and you'll slowly develop this pantry of experiences, a database of experiences that you can go in and select and curate from that list or from this sort of big overview. I'll say that no one has to see this worksheet but you. It is a space for you to brainstorm. Use the questions that are helpful. Ignore the questions that aren't helpful for you at this stage. It's totally yours to use and interact with. Feel free to add sections to the worksheet if you want, but it's yours to use. So take a minute, download the worksheet, spend as much time in that as you want or as you feel is appropriate for you at this stage, and when you're ready, start the Part 2 video.